He drugged his victims, strangled them, and then did something that shocked the entire world. He kept their body parts, ate their flesh, and preserved their skulls as trophies. He was living in an apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and his neighbors had no idea. Today, we're exploring the life, crimes, trial, and chilling interviews of Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the most disturbing serial killers in the history of the world, including the moment police unknowingly handed a victim back to him and walked away. If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's begin. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first son of Lionel Herbert Dahmer, an analytical chemist, and Joyce Annette Flint, a teletype machine instructor. So by all early appearances, the Dahmer household was a relatively normal middle-class family. But as Jeffrey grew older, the cracks in that picture began to show in ways that, looking back, were deeply significant. As a young child, Jeffrey was described as a happy, energetic, and curious boy. But around the age of 4, he underwent surgery for a double hernia, and those who knew him noted a distinct change in his personality afterward. He became more withdrawn, more insecure, and less engaged with the world around him. Whether the surgery itself or the circumstances surrounding it contributed to this shift has never been fully established, but it marked the beginning of a slow and steady withdrawal from normal childhood development. His parents' marriage was deeply troubled. Lionel and Joyce fought constantly, loud, bitter, and prolonged arguments that filled the household with tension and anxiety. Joyce suffered from significant mental health issues and was frequently medicated, sometimes to the point of being barely functional. She was described by those around her as demanding, emotionally volatile, and largely checked out as a mother. Lionel was consumed by his studies and his work, leaving Jeffrey largely to fend for himself emotionally. By the time Jeffrey was in his early teens, the family had moved to Bath Township in Summit County, Ohio. It was here that some of his most disturbing early behaviors began to emerge. He developed a fascination with dead animals, not an uncommon curiosity in children, but Jeffrey took it further. He began collecting roadkill, dissecting the carcasses, and preserving bones. He kept jars of insects and small animals. He was intensely interested in what was inside living things, what they looked like when opened up, and what happened to flesh and bone after death. His father, Lionel, himself a chemist with an interest in how chemicals interacted with organic matter, sometimes engaged with Jeffrey's questions without fully understanding the darkness that was growing behind them. Socially, Jeffrey was deeply isolated. He had very few friends, struggled to connect with his peers, and developed a significant drinking problem while still in high school, showing up to school drunk on more than one occasion. He was described by classmates as odd, quiet, and difficult to read. Some remembered him as darkly funny, a class clown of sorts who used humor to mask something that nobody could quite put their finger on. His parents finally divorced in 1978, the summer after Jeffrey graduated from high school. The divorce was ugly and protracted, and both parents were so consumed by their own conflict that Jeffrey was left almost entirely alone in the family home in Ohio for stretches of time with little food, no supervision, and no support. For it was during this period of almost complete abandonment that Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. In June of 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, and while his parents were consumed by their divorce, 18-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks on a road in Ohio. Hicks was on his way to a concert and accepted a ride. Dahmer brought him back to the family home, where the two drank beer and talked for several hours. When Hicks said he wanted to leave, something inside Dahmer snapped. He later said he did not want Hicks to go. He did not want to be alone. He struck Hicks from behind with a barbell, killing him. He then strangled him with the barbell to make sure he was dead. He dismembered the body, placed the remains in plastic bags, and buried them in the backyard of the family home. He later dug up the remains, dissolved the flesh using chemicals he had learned about from his father, and smashed the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them in the woods behind the house. It would be 9 years before Jeffrey Dahmer killed again. 9 years during which he drifted, struggled, and tried, or at least appeared to try, to hold his life together. His father Lionel, hoping to give his son structure and direction, encouraged him to enlist in the army. Jeffery enrolled at Ohio State University briefly, but dropped out after 1 semester and joined the United States Army in 1979. He was trained as a medic and was stationed in Germany, where his commanding officers described him as a capable soldier who nonetheless had a serious drinking problem. He was discharged early in 1981 due to his alcoholism. After his discharge, he drifted to Florida for a period before eventually returning to the Midwest, moving in with his grandmother Catherine in West Allis, Wisconsin in 1982. His grandmother was a deeply kind and patient woman who genuinely cared for Jeffery and tried to provide the stability he had never truly had. For a period, it seemed to work, but in 1986, he was arrested for exposing himself to 2 boys near a public lake. In 1988, he was arrested again for drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old boy named Somsak Synthesomphone, the younger brother of a boy who would later become one of his victims. He was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in a work release program and 5 years probation. He was required to register as a sex offender. It was around this same time that he moved out of his grandmother's home and into his own apartment at the Oxford Apartments at 213 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, the address that would become infamous around the world. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 16 more people, bringing his total victim count to 17. His victims were predominantly young Black and Hispanic gay men, many of them picked up at gay bars, bathhouses, and shopping malls in the Milwaukee area. Or he would lure them with the promise of money in exchange for posing for photographs, or simply with the offer of companionship and alcohol. Once back at his apartment, he would drug their drinks with sleeping pills, sometimes crushing them and dissolving them in alcohol, and wait for the drugs to take effect. Once his victims were incapacitated, he would strangle them. What came after was what made Jeffrey Dahmer unlike almost any other serial killer in American history. He engaged in necrophilia with his victims. He photographed the bodies at various stages. He dismembered them, keeping certain body parts, skulls, hands, genitalia, as trophies. He experimented with preserving flesh and bone using chemicals. And he cooked and consumed the flesh of some of his victims, later telling investigators that he did this because he wanted them to become a part of him permanently, so that they could never leave. He attempted to create what he called zombies, living, for compliant companions who would never leave him, by drilling holes into the skulls of victims who were still alive and injecting muriatic acid directly into their brains. Every one of those attempts resulted in the victim's death. The horror of what took place inside apartment 213 is almost beyond the capacity of language to describe. What is perhaps most disturbing about the Dahmer case is not just what he did, but how long he was able to do it, and how many times he nearly got caught, but didn't. The most infamous and heartbreaking near miss in the Jeffrey Dahmer case came on May 27, 1991. A 14-year-old Laotian boy named Konorak Synthesomphone, the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had previously been convicted of assaulting, was found wandering the street outside Dahmer's apartment building, naked, bleeding, and clearly heavily drugged and disoriented. 2 young women in the neighborhood, Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith, called 911 and tried to help the boy. When police officers arrived, Officers John Balsazak and Joseph Gabrish, Dahmer appeared on the scene and calmly told them that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had been drinking, and that the boy had simply had too much to drink. The officers, despite the protests of the 2 women who had called for help, unaccepted Dahmer's explanation. They walked the boy back upstairs to Dahmer's apartment, noted a strange smell but did not investigate further, and left. Konorak Synthesomphone was murdered that same night. He was 14 years old. The 2 officers involved were later fired from the Milwaukee Police Department, though they were reinstated on appeal. The case became a landmark moment in discussions about racial bias in policing. Konorak was a young Asian boy. And his life was placed in the hands of a white man the officers seemed to find more credible without question. There were other near misses, too. Neighbors had repeatedly complained about terrible smells coming from Dahmer's apartment. He explained it away as a broken freezer or rotting meat. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, had even accepted food from Dahmer on occasion. Food she later learned may have contained human remains.
Human bodies, eating body parts. I have eaten a sandwich from you. I have probably eaten someone's body part. How dare you do this to me?
The thought haunted her for the rest of her life. And the end came on July 22nd, 1991. Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, had been lured to Dahmer's apartment that evening. Dahmer handcuffed one of Edwards' wrists and held a knife to him. But Edwards managed to keep Dahmer calm and distracted for several hours before finding an opportunity to punch him in the face, break free, and run out of the apartment and into the street, still wearing one handcuff. He flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, and led them back to Dahmer's apartment. When they arrived, Dahmer initially tried to maintain his calm demeanor, even offering to get the key for the handcuffs from the bedroom. One of the officers went to the bedroom to look for the key and opened the refrigerator. Inside was a human head. What followed was one of the most shocking crime scene discoveries in American law enforcement history. Co-investigators found 3 more severed heads in the apartment. A barrel in the bedroom contained the remains of 3 torsos dissolving in acid. Preserved skulls were found in a filing cabinet. Photographs of dismembered bodies were found throughout the apartment. Body parts were found in the freezer. In total, the remains of 11 victims were found inside apartment 213. Dahmer was arrested without resistance, so he told the officers, "I should have been more careful." He then gave a full and extraordinarily detailed confession over the following days, cooperating with investigators and describing each of his crimes with a calm and clinical thoroughness that left detectives deeply shaken. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dahmer had already pleaded guilty to the 15 counts of murder he was charged with in Wisconsin, the murders of Stephen Hicks having occurred in Ohio and being handled separately. The sole question before the court was therefore not whether he had committed the murders, but whether he was legally sane at the time he committed them. His defense attorney, Gerald Boyle, argued passionately that Dahmer was suffering from a mental disease, a paraphilic disorder so severe that it rendered him unable to conform his behavior to the requirements of the law. Boyle described his client as a runaway train on a track to nowhere, a deeply disturbed and mentally ill man who needed treatment rather than punishment. The prosecution, led by District Attorney E. Michael McCann, argued equally forcefully that Dahmer was legally sane, that his deliberate, calculated, and methodical behavior before, during, and after his crimes demonstrated a man fully in control of his actions and fully aware of their wrongfulness. They pointed to the fact that Dahmer had taken careful steps to avoid detection, that he had successfully maintained a normal outward life for years while committing his crimes, and that he had shown the capacity to stop himself on occasions when the risk of discovery was too high. 15 mental health experts testified during the trial, some for the defense, some for the prosecution. The testimony was complex, contradictory, and at times deeply disturbing, as details of Dahmer's crimes were described in clinical detail in open court. The jury deliberated for just under 10 hours before returning their verdict on February 15, 1992. They found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane on all 15 counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, 957 years in total, with no possibility of parole. A 16th life sentence was later added following his conviction in Ohio for the murder of Stephen Hicks. When the verdict was read, Dahmer showed almost no reaction. His father Lionel wept in the courtroom. The families of his victims erupted in both grief and relief. One family member of a victim had to be physically restrained after lunging toward Dahmer in the courtroom. Jeffrey Dahmer gave several interviews during his time in prison, the most significant and widely watched of which was his interview with journalist Stone Phillips for Dateline NBC in 1994, conducted alongside his father Lionel. It remains one of the most chilling and watched true crime interviews ever recorded. During that interview, Dahmer spoke with a quiet, measured calm that many viewers found deeply unsettling. He did not appear to be the raving monster that people might have expected. He was articulate, reflective, and appeared genuinely to be grappling with what he had done. Though whether that grappling was genuine remorse or simply the performance of remorse has been debated ever since. Some of the most memorable and chilling things Dahmer said during his interviews include:
You would pick the carcasses up from the road and take them back into the woods.
Take them back in the woods, skin them sometimes, slit them all the way open, look at the organs, feel them. There was a sort of general excitement for me. I don't know why. It was exciting to see.
When asked why he kept body parts and consumed flesh, he said he wanted his victims to become a permanent part of him. He said he felt that by consuming them, he could keep them with him forever, and they would never be able to leave. He described his loneliness as so profound and so consuming that it drove him to acts he himself described as unthinkable. When asked whether he believed he was born evil or became evil, he said he did not believe in God at the time he was committing his crimes, that he believed in nothing, that there was no moral framework governing his actions, and that this absence of belief made it easier to do what he did. He later stated in prison that he had converted to Christianity and that faith had given him the framework of right and wrong he had lacked for most of his life. When asked if he felt remorse, he said yes. But his description of remorse was complicated. He expressed sorrow for what he had put his family through. He expressed regret for the pain he had caused. But his ability to fully connect emotionally with the humanity of his victims in the way a person with normal empathy would was clearly limited. And that limitation was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all about Jeffrey Dahmer. His father Lionel, who sat beside him during the Dateline interview, spoke with raw and visible anguish about his son, about the signs he had missed, the moments he wished he had intervened, and the guilt of being the father of a man who had done what Jeffrey had done. Lionel later wrote a book titled A Father's Story, in which he explored his son's life and his own desperate search for answers and understanding. In prison, Dahmer was initially placed in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and the obvious risk he faced from other inmates. He was eventually moved to a less restricted setting and began working in the prison's cleaning crew. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver while on a work detail in the prison gymnasium at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Another inmate, Jesse Anderson, was also killed in the same attack. Scarver used a metal bar from the prison weight room. Dahmer died from severe head trauma before he could receive medical treatment. He was 34 years old. Christopher Scarver later gave interviews in which he stated that Dahmer had been provocative toward other inmates, taunting them by fashioning prison food into shapes resembling severed limbs and covering them with ketchup to look like blood. Whether this account is entirely accurate has been debated, but Scarver was unapologetic about what he had done. He said Dahmer had shown no remorse and that God had told him to do it. For many of the families of Dahmer's victims, the news of his death was met with a complicated mixture of emotions: relief, anger that he had escaped a full lifetime of imprisonment, and for some, a grief that his death did nothing to resolve. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 people between 1978 and 1991. He was 34 years old when he died. He spent just 3 years in prison for crimes that had destroyed 17 lives and shattered the families and communities those people had belonged to. He was not a fictional monster. He was a deeply damaged, profoundly lonely, and utterly dangerous human being who was failed at almost every turn. By his parents, by the systems that should have caught him earlier, by the police officers who handed a 14-year-old boy back to him and walked away. 17 people lost their lives inside that apartment on North 25th Street, and their lives deserve to be remembered. This is the dark truth about Jeffrey Dahmer, and it always will be. Thanks everyone for watching. See you again in the next episode, and don't forget to like and subscribe.